Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me, and I hope that you're all nice and comfortable wherever you are and having a nice lunch session. I'm doing this presentation remotely myself, so you're going to hear me say next slide a couple of dozen times just to let the people in the studio know that they can move on. So as introduced, I'm going to talk about Cake and about open banking a little bit. I'm just going to give a short introduction about what those terms are. And then I'm going to deep dive into the experiences we've had with the open banking APIs. I'm not going to get too technical, but I'm going to identify a few key challenges that we see in the market. So next slide, please. So just to introduce Cake, so Cake is a technology and a data company, and we analyze financial data and we try to improve the financial well-being and help people understand their finances better. And we do that by creating a new innovative business model that shares the revenue that we make with our customers in return for the data that they give us. But I'll deep dive into that a little bit later. So next slide. Yeah, just to introduce us, so we started back in November 2018, so almost 2 years ago, with this founding team. As you can see, I'm also a co-founder at Cake, and I'm the head of engineering there, so I'm responsible for the architecture of the applications that we build and to manage the engineering team that builds the application. And in that role, I've been heavily involved with all the PSD2 and open banking APIs that we use. Next slide. Yeah, and here they are. So I have to give credit where credits are due. So these are the awesome engineers that work for Cake. So it's important to note that we're a fully remote company. So even before COVID-19, we have no offices. We work currently in about 3 countries. And everybody's quite used to doing things remotely. Next slide. I just want to pause here for a moment because this was actually the conclusion of an interesting study performed in 2019 by Interim, and it concluded with the fact that 4 out of 10 Europeans are insufficiently financially literate. So just think about that. 4 out of 10 Europeans don't understand their finances. So it's about Europe, so it's not about some third world country. It's about rich European countries where virtually everybody has access to the financial system. Everybody has a bank account, everybody has a debit account. There's virtually nobody who is left out of the financial system, but still 4 out of 10 people don't understand how those finances work. Next slide. And this was the mindset that the EU had when they started thinking about open banking and PSD2. So they realized back in 2008, after the big financial crisis, a lot of effort had been made to save the financial system from falling over. A lot of money had been injected into those banks. But as a result, not a lot of time and effort went to actually improving the financial understanding of the everyday European consumer. And that was the mindset behind open banking and PSD2. So PSD2 was a directive created to open up access to the financial system, to force banks basically to provide APIs that allow companies like Cake and like Oper to create new financial services that would be innovative, and that would be the hope, at least at the end of the day, would improve the financial situation of the European consumer. And that's important to remember when we talk about PSD2. I'll give a few examples. So PSD2, what can you do with PSD2? So you can do a lot of things with it, but I'm going to simplify it. So the first thing you can do is you can aggregate all the account information that you have at all the different banks. So for example, what we do at Cake is we take all your accounts from Belfius, KBC, Argenta, every bank that you can imagine, and we bring that into one overview. We make that clear and easy to understand. And then we start giving you financial advice and some highlights and tips just to let you manage those finances in a more clear way. The second thing that you can do is also instruct your bank to make payments. For example, the illustration that we have here is that you've just received your wage. We've calculated how much money you should have left over by the end of the month, and then we say, hey, you can transfer this money to your saving account. So really creating a one-stop for all your finances. The next slide, please. But also in the long term, financial data is a very, very rich data source. And what we try to do is we use machine learning, we use AI to really aggregate all of that data and to try to detect patterns, to see how well you're doing, if you're not doing well, and what we can improve. And that's important because a lot of customers, like we said, so 4 out of 10 Europeans have trouble understanding what they should do. So what we do right now in the app is we give you an overview of your cash flow situation this month and next month, and do it with all of those fancy graphs and confusing statistics. We just give you an overview. Look, this is where you spent the most money last month. This is where you normally spend your money. This is something that you can do. And this is something that we think that this can really simplify the user's experience. Something completely different that we do is also we reward our users for giving their data to Cake. So if you shop at one of our partners and we see the transaction in Cake, we immediately match that and we give you cash back without cutting any coupons, without having to use any loyalty cards or whatever. We immediately process that and we give you a cash back. This is also something that Cake makes money on. And what we also do is we take all of the financial data that we get, we aggregate those, we anonymize those, and then we create market statistics on that. And every time a partner of ours pays for those market statistics, we split that money back and we give it once a month. We give 50% back to our users. Next slides. And yeah, normally I didn't put this in here initially, but I just wanted to put it in here back again, just to say the core idea behind PSD2 is to improve the financial situation of consumers. So if you do something with this data, if you build new products, it should really benefit those customers. And that's why what Oper did is so dramatically reducing the complexity of the mortgage system. I think that's a great example. What we do is we give money back to our consumers so that they can actually profit from their financial data. And I hope that the use cases we see in the coming years will also continue on this trend. All right, so that was quickly a short introduction on open banking and Cake, just to give you guys some background. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the APIs and how does that open banking landscape in Europe, how does that look like? So let's start with the good news on the next slide. So the good news is today, all major banks in Belgium and in the Netherlands have at least decently working API. Some banks have great APIs, some banks have a good API, and some banks have APIs, okay, they just work. From a basic scenario, from a basic situation, I think PSD2 works today, but it took a lot of time to get here. So normally PSD2 should have been ready in September 2019 and will probably only support all use cases by January next year. So it takes a lot of time, but at least the good news is that for most banks, it's working. And I can illustrate that with some figures. So currently at Cake, we have about 15,000 unique financial bank accounts connected in our system, and we've processed about 2.4 billion euros worth of transactional data from those accounts. So that's a nice place to start, but of course we can grow a lot bigger once we find more traction in the market, like Geert also already mentioned. At this stage, it's mainly convincing customers that it's safe, that it's easy to use, and that it benefits, of course, their finances. And yeah, so much for the good news. Also something that Geert already briefly touched upon is, but one of the first things we noticed back in September 2019 is that a lot of APIs, a lot of banks had built sandboxes, as they call them, which are basically test systems to test those APIs. And as soon as we went live with those APIs, we realized, okay, those sandboxes, they really weren't being representative of the actual situation. So not all use cases were supported, not even all API functionalities were supported in those sandboxes, and certainly not all data points were supported. So as soon as we went live with those APIs back in 2019, things got a lot messier, and yeah, it wasn't as easy as those sandboxes made it out to be. So we realized that there was a lot of work to be done. And some of those issues, I've listed them out here. Yeah, they went from small issues to very big issues to some basic things that really needed to be there. So for example, the first time we connected accounts and fetched the transactions from those APIs, we noticed a lot of data was missing. Not the names were missing, dates were missing, basically the basic information that you need to build an API. And yeah, if the only purpose of your API, of the account API, is to provide data about transactions and the information is not there, well, that's not really doing a great job, of course. Some banks did not have the proper amount of history enabled. And more strikingly, not all authentication methods were supported. So you have to imagine you're a consumer, you've been using the mobile apps of banks for a couple of years now, you've signed, you make payments with your mobile app, you sign with your mobile app, and then suddenly Kate comes along, and then we have to ask for your permission to get your data. And the first thing you have to do is get out your card reader and get out your bank cards to sign a process. And yeah, you don't know where the hell that thing is because you've thrown it out 4 years ago since you never had to use it anymore. And that was striking that this was a situation back in 2019 that basically a lot of gaps were there in the system. Some banks even made a sport out of it. They kept lists of mobile devices that they supported, and every time a new supplier brought out a new mobile phone, it wasn't supported. And then they said, yeah, we can update the list, but it takes us 3 months for a new release. So you're going to have to wait 3 months before your mobile device is supported. I think as an everyday consumer, you can imagine that's not funny, and that's not something that you expect to happen. And then, yeah, some other issues. We actually had 2 data leaks in the last year for a major Belgian bank. So they actually sent the wrong information of wrong consumers to TPPs. Yeah, I can tell you when we had those meetings, they were no longer laughing and smiling. It became dead serious then, and they realized a lot of work had to be done to make those things working operationally. And that brings me to the challenges that we've identified and that we see, at least in open banking, is that APIs were built to technically comply with the regulations, but we're actually missing a lot of crucial features. And most of the times when we analyze this is that we just saw that they didn't think of the users. They lacked some kind of user-centric design when they were designing these APIs. And it's really important to know that, okay, you build an API, somebody's going to use it to integrate it in their systems, but at the end of the day, it's going to be a user who is going to use your product, who is going to use the API to do something. And if you've not taken into account all those different use cases, like we said, not supporting all authentication methods, or not even supporting all types of accounts. We saw some banks in the beginning, they supported the basic simple personal accounts, but as soon as you had a shared account with different mandates or business accounts, they were not supported. They were only going to be supported a year after. Well, I can tell you as a consumer, you're not happy. So the first thing that the challenge that we saw is that a lot of thought needed to go into actually supporting all the different functional features before they were actually really compliant with the intention of PSD2. The second challenge that we saw, and I cannot stress this enough, the most important phase of building an API comes only after you've built it. After you've set the API live, then is when it really starts getting difficult. That is when you're really going to find the challenges with your API, and only then you will really be able to identify what you need to do to actually make your API successful. And to do that, you need clear SLAs on when will your API be available, what's the expected performance of the API, and when are you going to do maintenance on those APIs. It's important to communicate with the users of your API, but also you need a good monitoring system to actually see how is my API being used, how is the performance of my API? What errors am I seeing? Is everything going as I expected? In the beginning, we had a lot of problems just getting the APIs working. And yeah, the banks were actually asking us, okay, and what did you do? And what error did we send you? Is that really an error that came from our system? They were just working in the dark and they only installed monitoring system afterwards. And that's something that's really important. You're only going to see how your API is working as soon as you've actually set the API live. And then finally, I think Geert also mentioned it. APIs, APIs exist in an ecosystem. So often APIs are built to integrate systems with each other, but I like to look at it from the perspective of the user experiences. So I always say APIs are used to integrate the user experience and provide new services to consumers. And because of this, if you look at it like this way, you realize that you need collaboration and cooperation to define and maintain these APIs across the entire lifetime. So you can't just start with an API, draft some requirements with your partners at the very beginning of those, at the very beginning of when you're starting to build the API. You really need to collaborate along the entire process and find out, okay, why are they going to use the API? How are they planning to use the API? What is that they're actually trying to achieve? And when you look at it like that, then you realize an API is not just a technical delivery, something that we IT people deliver and then somebody starts to use, but it's actually the result of a partnership between two actors. It can be between companies, between a company and a user, or between consumers, but it's always a partnership. Somebody is trying to achieve a certain goal by using your API, and both parties benefit. And if both parties benefit, then it's a partnership. And if you look at it like that, the entire design process behind an API, it just dramatically changes. And that's kind of the message I wanna end it with. Before I start going into the questions, I may have talked a little bit too fast, but that just means that there is time for more questions. And yeah, I always find those most interesting. So if you guys have any questions, shoot, and I'll try to answer.
All right. I will start with the first question, and it's actually a question: how do you want to tackle the free PSD2 APIs versus the more commercial APIs that a number of banks are offering?
Yeah, that's true. So open banking is a lot more than just PSD2. So PSD2 just sets the bar, the bare minimum that banks have to achieve. Of course, these are free. And let's face it, banks have to invest some time and money, often quite some time to build them. So it's only natural that they are also looking into other open banking solutions that they can actually also benefit from and make some revenue. And I think that's the natural way that this will evolve. So PSD2 sets the bare minimum that everybody should have access to. And then, for example, if you want to have more data, if you want to have access to other products, then they will provide APIs that fintechs like Cake and like Oper would be willing to pay for. And I don't see this as a negative situation, but only as a natural evolution of the entire open banking landscape. I do think that as a first step, banks need to really comply with PSD2, provide all the functionalities that are required by law, and only then companies like us, like Cake, will start looking into those other open banking APIs for something that really adds value to the customer.
Then the next question, how do you find the collaboration of the banks, given that a number of them still need to improve their API quality?
I think it evolved a lot. So asked me that question in September 2019, and then I would say it was dreadful. Only about 20% of the use cases were working, and most of them were not open to any conversation on how to improve. But today we've had a lot of good conversations with certain banks, and a lot of banks that are actually at this point improving a lot of their APIs based on the feedback that we gave. And by January, we do expect a big improvement overall. That said, it's a mixed situation. So there are some banks who really start making an effort and who are starting to see the benefit of PSD2 and open banking for them as well. And there are still a few laggards who are just waiting to see what happens in the market. But I think that's always the same. I'm just glad that at least we've been able to convince the most major banks to actually collaborate with us and start improving their APIs.
Then somebody asked a very serious question. If you also have plans to include football match highlights in the Cake app.
Yeah, I think this question has been asked a lot on Twitter. So it was a funny situation, but on our end, we're just focusing on strictly on the finances and on building out the financial coach, as we call it. And I think we have enough work for the coming 2-3 years before we need to start looking into any fancy things like football matches in our app. So at the moment, not right now.
Then the next question, how do you basically, when pulling the transactions from the customers, how do you identify the participating merchants?
How do we identify them? So we synchronize data about 4 times a day when the customer is not around, and every time that he logs into the app. The first thing we do is we have a fully event-based architecture, so we put all those transactions on an event queue, and then we have machine learning models running. We will start picking out the information out of those transactions, combining those, and then start identifying who those merchants are. So there's information in the description of the rewards, there's terminal information, information on the counterpart, and when we combine those together with the feedback that our customers have already given us on certain transactions, then our model is able to identify, okay, this is that merchant, but not just that merchant, it was that location, it was that store, it was this category, and then that information comes back into our app. And there we process the rewards that we have with certain partners. And if we find a match, we just process it through our system. So it's fully event driven and it happens real time. So I think from the moment that we pull in the transaction, it takes about maybe 10-15 seconds before we can identify a merchant and the reward.
Then another question on the collaboration with the banks. How do they inform you about changes that they're going to do in their APIs? And also then second one linked to it, how do they tackle the versioning of their APIs?
Okay. It's a bit of a mixed situation. So most banks at the moment have developer portals where they publish their APIs and publish change logs about those APIs. Some of those banks really have a good way of working. So they announce a new version of their app well upfront, about 2-3 months. They announce these are going to be the changes. This is the new API. You can already start migrating in test, and then you can migrate in production, and so on. And then at some point, they deprecate the old API. So really, as it should be, really API-centric thinking. Others, just publish a new API version, and then we notice that it breaks. That didn't happen, fortunately enough, in the last few months anymore. So I hope we're past that phase. But interestingly, what I think is a good example is actually Open Banking UK. So Open Banking UK is the same as PSD2, but they created, all banks together created, together with the TPPs, created one portal where all APIs are published, where all uptimes, where all issues are listed, where all API versions are listed, and where there is a really good communication strategy. And what I hope is in the future is that also in Europe, we'll create an open banking portal where just all banks, all TPPs can collaborate together and really start working on a professional way using PSD2 APIs. But like I said, it's a mixed situation. So.
Then the next question, are you running your own data center or are you relying on a cloud provider?
Yeah. So we use a cloud provider. So from day one, we decided to start with a cloud infrastructure, build out a microservice architecture, build an event-based architecture, and of course, as a small startup, it was really basically a no-brainer to start on a cloud provider because it gives us the a really big advantage in terms of speed of development, quality of services, and access to products that otherwise would be very expensive and very hard to build out if you're starting from scratch as a startup. And I think we see that also for most APIs. I think a lot of PSD2 hubs are being hosted also on cloud data centers at the moment. And you see that banks are also moving into a hybrid situation, part cloud hosting, part their own data center hosting. And I think you'll see that a lot in finance, that they're really trying to leverage the speed that the cloud provider can provide for running services like ours.
Then the next question, it's can you blame the banks for acting the way they're acting, and should not, let's say, the European government or the national government play a role in them to get them in line?
Yeah, well, we certainly don't blame anybody. I mean, it's I think it's a big change, something that was really forced into the market, and that takes time to evolve. It is indeed the national governments, but it's actually the national banks of each country that supervise these changes. And what we did as Cake, we founded A7 and 8, and after that Pay Belgium. So we founded a group together, all TPPs in Belgium, to discuss the state of the APIs and to also talk to the National Bank of Belgium, give them suggestions, give them information on how the APIs are running. And then since then, we've set up, I think, quite a few meetings together with the different banks in Belgium to discuss what was going wrong, what was going well, what could we improve. So a lot of work has been going on behind the scenes to really improve the situation of those APIs. And I think it just takes effort from all sides. I think in the very beginning, most banks did not really understand what was expected of PSD2, because of course it's written from a legal point of view by the EU. And I don't know if you read a lot of legal text. I certainly don't, but most of the time it's not as clear as let's say an API spec. So there was a lot of work going on just getting to the core requirements of PSD2, and we've done that for about a year now. And that's also something that improved the relationship a lot in Belgium. We're still not 100% there, but I'm glad with the way it's improving.
And then the final question for today, it's about PayPal interoperability. It's basically how you can identify the merchants when transactions are done over PayPal. So quite a technical question, I would say.
Yeah. Let's see. At the moment, we don't integrate PayPal, and we get those information directly from the PSD2 APIs from the banks. And sometimes the information is included, sometimes it's not. It highly depends on the card schema that was being used to actually make the PayPal payment. So it's all very technical in the backend. There are a lot of different payment schemas currently operational in the EU, and PSD2 is also an attempt to structure that and to streamline that. So in about half of the cases, we have enough information to identify that. What we are going to do is actually by the end of this year, we are going to integrate PayPal directly into our apps, because they also provide payments accounts and they also need to expose APIs to players like Cake. And then it's going to become a lot easier to identify that information and do all the bookkeeping for you guys so that it doesn't take a lot of time anymore and you can just automate it. So at the moment it's 50-50, and by the end of the year, I think we will have tackled that problem completely.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for having answered the questions.
Yeah, no problem.